I inherited a merchant house, so deep in debt. Every bank had written it off, but I was the world's most ruthless hedge fund manager in my past life. My name is Kel Voren. And the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes in this world was a man throwing a chair through a window, not at me, just through it, out of pure, helpless frustration. 2 floors up, glass exploding outwards, spinning into the gray morning air and shattering on the cobblestones below with a sound like a small catastrophe. The kind of sound that makes everyone on the street stop and look up. I was sitting behind a desk that hadn't been polished in months. The wood was warped at the edges, the finish cracked and peeling near the corners. An inkwell had been tipped over on the left side, the spill dried into a black bruise spreading across the surface. 3 candles burned low in their holders, wax pooled thick at the base, running out of room. The curtains were half drawn. Morning light cut through the gap at an angle that illuminated every particle of dust floating in the air of a room that had not been cleaned in at least 2 weeks. And in front of me, 8 men in expensive coats who had arrived before I even fully understood where I was, who had been waiting, who had been building toward this moment for days, possibly weeks, and had finally gotten their meeting. The man who threw the chair turned around, large, broad, the kind of large that comes from 2 decades of getting exactly what you want because you were willing to make the alternative seem unpleasant. Merchant class, probably guild-ranked 3rd tier based on the clasp on his coat. He had a red face and the look of a man who had arrived fully confident and was now experiencing something he didn't have a category for. He pointed a thick finger across the desk at me. "Voren's dead," he said. "4 days ago, which means the house is forfeit. Debt transfers to the estate. The estate is you." He let his hand drop and looked around at the other 7 men as though inviting them to agree with the obvious. Several of them nodded. "So, when do we get paid?" I looked at him. In my past life, I had sat in rooms that felt exactly like this one. Different furniture, different currency, different accents, but the same architecture of pressure. 8 men who had done their math on the way over and arrived certain they knew how this ended. Who were performing confidence because they believed the performance was all it would take. I'd learned a long time ago that confident men make the best opponents. They stop watching the board at exactly the wrong moment. I placed both hands flat on the desk, looked at the man with the red face, then at each of the other 7, one at a time, not hostile, assessing, the way you assess a position. "Get me the ledgers," I said. "All of them, complete. Every account, every outstanding instrument, every payable and receivable. I want everything on this desk within the hour." Pause. And then get out. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then the red-faced man laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. "You don't have—" "The ledgers," I said. "Within the hour. The conversation you want to have comes after I've reviewed them." I looked at him steadily. "Or you can go file your seizure notice today and start the legal process. That takes 4 months minimum under guild dispute rules, which I'm sure you're aware of. Or you can give me an hour." He stared at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not agreement, but hesitation. Hesitation was all I needed. "1 hour," he said. They left. Let me explain where I actually came from. 3 days before I woke up in this room, which is to say, from my perspective, approximately 48 hours before my life ended, I was 39 years old and sitting in the back of a car on a highway, reading a position report on my phone. My fund had just closed its best quarter in 6 years, 42% return in a market where the consensus had been flat to negative. My partners were sending messages that contained more exclamation marks than I'd seen from professional adults in years. My senior analyst, who had not taken a full weekend off in 4 months, had sent a single message that said simply, "I need to sleep for a week." I'd written back, "You've earned it, Monday." And then I'd gone back to reading the report because the next quarter was already in motion and I was already 3 moves ahead of where we were. And then the truck came through the highway divider. And then I was here, Calum Voren, 22 years old, sole surviving heir to the Voren trading house in the capital city of Karath, which was the primary commercial center of the Edenmore Kingdom. His father, Aldrich Voren, had died 4 days ago from a fever that moved through him in 72 hours and left nothing on the other side. In the time between Aldrich's death and the moment I woke up in his son's body, the following things had already happened. Half the staff had quit, not resigned formally, simply stopped appearing. The ones who'd been there longest knew the numbers better than anyone and had made their calculations accordingly. 2 creditors had filed formal asset seizure notices with the Merchant Guild. The house's senior accountant, a man named Brell who had managed Aldrich's books for 11 years, had, on the morning after Aldrich died, gone into the records room, removed 3 years of financial documents, carried them to the back courtyard, and burned them. Then he had walked out of the building and disappeared into the city. The burning of the records was the most interesting thing I'd encountered so far. Not the most alarming. The most interesting. A man who burns records before he runs is a man who was either personally implicated in something or who knew enough to be afraid of what would happen when someone looked carefully. Either way, he had decided that the safest thing was for those specific records not to exist. That told me something. I filed it. The 8 creditors who arrived that morning represented total outstanding claims of approximately 200,000 marks between them. There were others. The 8 were simply the ones aggressive enough to show up in person before the body was cold. I had one advantage, coming into this position from outside, no emotional attachment to any of it. When you inherit something you've grown up in, the weight of it distorts your judgment. Every decision is filtered through memory and obligation and the fear of failing something that someone else built. Aldrich had been making decisions in that mode for 15 years, reactive, frightened, trying to preserve something that was already past saving with the tools he had. His decisions were legible in the ledgers. Every defensive move, every short-term fix, every desperate borrowing to cover a problem that created a larger problem. The handwriting of a man who couldn't see the whole board because he was too close to it. I had no memories of this house, no loyalty to the decisions that had gotten it here, no sense that any particular approach deserved to be preserved because it was the way things had been done. I had ledgers and a window and a city I didn't know yet, and I had 20 years of training that nobody in this room or this city or probably this entire kingdom had any framework for. I started reading. The ledgers told me 3 things in the first 20 minutes. First, the actual debt load, 430,000 gold marks total, spread across 14 creditors, not all of it equally urgent. Some was callable on demand, some had fixed terms extending 6 months or more, some had clauses I needed to read more carefully because they had conditions attached that weren't immediately obvious. I made a column for each creditor: name, amount, terms, urgency, leverage. The leverage column stayed empty for most of them for now. Second, the actual assets, not what the debt documents claimed as collateral, what actually existed and had value. The building we were sitting in, a tannery 3 kilometers outside the city walls that had reported operating losses for 3 consecutive years, a 15% stake in a river barge operation called the Carath Southern Fleet that ran cargo between the capital and the river delta ports, a warehouse on the East Dock Road that was currently 70% empty and generating minimal income, and the family name itself, which had theoretical value as a merchant house charter, but which at this precise moment was associated strongly in the market with collapse and default. Third, there was a gap in the records that wasn't just about the burned documents. Even accounting for what Brell had destroyed, the remaining 3 years of financials didn't cohere. The income figures for the barge stake were too low, consistently. Every quarter for 3 years, the Carath Southern Fleet had reported operating margins to the Voren House that were, based on what I could cross-reference from guild filings, approximately 40% below what the fleet's actual routes should have generated. Either the fleet was performing significantly worse than public records indicated, or someone had been skimming the distributions before they reached the Voren ledgers. I circled that entry 3 times. By the time the ledger review was finished, I had a picture. The picture was bad. It was also, and this was the crucial thing, not terminal. Bad and terminal are different conditions. Bad means the numbers are against you and you need a different strategy. Terminal means the numbers are against you and there is no strategy. 430,000 marks of debt against a collapsing revenue base was bad. It was not terminal. The assets were real. Some of them were underperforming by design, not by nature. And the market I was operating in had, in the first hour of paying attention, shown me at least one situation that looked significantly mispriced. That was all I needed to start. I called the one staff member who had shown up that morning, a young man of about 18, name of Pell. He'd been a junior records clerk for the house for 2 years. He had careful eyes and the posture of someone who had spent 2 years being told that his job was to stay invisible and not form opinions. He was clearly waiting to be informed that he was unemployed. "Pell," I said, "I'm keeping you on. I need 3 things this morning. First, I need you to find me the guild registry filings for every major timber import operation in Karath for the past 12 months. These are public record. Second, I need the freight repair logs from the Karath Southern Fleet and the 2 other major river barge operators. Third," I paused because this one was going to require a different kind of resource. "I need someone who knows the current market pricing for ironwood timber, not the posted guild rate. The actual rate, what it's trading for in private transactions." He was writing quickly. "The repair logs might be difficult. The barge operators don't always file those publicly." "Then find someone at the docks who has access to them informally," I said. "You've been working near the guild district for 2 years. You must know people." He thought for a moment. "There's a man at the River Authority who's been here longer than anyone. He keeps all the records. He owes me a favor from last spring." "That's what I need," I said. "Use it. And Pell," he looked up, "don't mention to anyone what you're researching. If someone asks what you're doing for the house, say we're reviewing operational assets. That's true, just incomplete." He nodded and left quickly. I turned back to the ledgers. I had a theory forming. I needed the data to test it. But before the data arrived, I had 43 other creditors to begin managing. Here's something I understood from my first week in finance that most people never learn at all. Debt is not the same as danger. People treat debt as a measure of how much trouble you're in. It's not. Debt is a tool. Like any tool, it can be misused to the point where it becomes a trap, but the tool itself is neutral. What matters is not the size of the debt. What matters is 3 things: the structure of the debt. When is it callable? What are the conditions? What flexibility exists in the terms? The relationship between the debt and the assets it's secured against. Are the assets undervalued? Are they being used correctly? Is there optionality that hasn't been exercised? And the third thing, which is the one most people miss completely, the information asymmetry between you and your creditors. Your creditors know what you owe them. They know the terms they agreed to. What they don't know, what they can almost never know unless you tell them, is what you know about the market you're operating in, what moves you're planning to make, what information you've gathered that changes the picture. The 8 men who had sat in this office that morning believed they understood the Voron situation because they understood the debt figures. They didn't understand that I was sitting inside this position with a completely different view of what those figures meant and what was possible within them. That asymmetry was the only real asset I had right now. I spent 3 days in communication with every creditor, not defensive communication, informational, precise, calm updates on my review of the house's position, delivered with the confidence of someone who had reviewed much larger and more complex positions and found them manageable. I didn't lie. I said the house was conducting a comprehensive operational review, that I expected to have a strategic update ready within 30 days, that I was committed to honoring all legitimate obligations, and that if anyone wished to initiate legal seizure proceedings in the interim, that was their right. But I would note that the process would take significantly longer than 30 days and would likely result in a lower recovery than a negotiated resolution. 3 creditors initiated proceedings anyway, the ones who had been planning to regardless. The other 11 waited. That was enough. The repair logs arrived on the 5th day. Pell had gotten them through his River Authority contact, who had apparently been waiting years for someone to notice what they contained and was practically relieved to have an excuse to share them. I read them twice, Then I read them a third time, cross-referencing against the guild pricing data Pell had also pulled. My theory held. Ironwood was the finest structural timber in the kingdom for river barge construction, dense, rot-resistant, with a natural oil content that made it nearly impervious to extended water exposure. Every serious barge operator in Karath needed it for hull repair work. When a barge's hull planking deteriorated, from water damage, from impact, from simple age, you replaced the damaged sections with ironwood if you wanted the repair to last. You could use cheaper softwood instead. The repair would look the same, but it would fail in one season instead of lasting 5 years. The repair log showed a pattern that was almost too clean. All three major barge operators had systematically reduced their ironwood maintenance schedules over the past 18 months, not slightly, dramatically. Operations that had historically replaced hull sections at regular intervals were now running barges well past any reasonable maintenance threshold. Emergency repairs were being patched with inferior materials. 3 vessels had sunk in the past year. 2 others had required expensive emergency dry dock work, and the ironwood pricing data showed that the market rate had been essentially flat for 2 years, completely flat. In a period when, according to a 3-year-old guild report I had found in Aldrich's correspondence, the supply from the Velmere forest had declined by approximately 30% due to a blight in the older growth sections. Supply down 30%, price flat. That was wrong. In any functioning market, a 30% supply reduction causes a price increase. That's not theory, that's mechanics. The only way price stays flat when supply contracts is if someone with significant market power is actively preventing the price from rising, suppressing it, releasing stored inventory into the market at the exact rate needed to keep prices down, while simultaneously preventing new supply from entering the channel. I pulled the guild registry filings, 2 houses, Drevenmarch and Solian. Between them, based on the warehouse registry filings, they were holding an estimated 18 months of ironwood supply, not selling it, sitting on it, waiting. I thought about what they were waiting for. It took about 2 minutes to work out. Spring flood season, 6 to 8 weeks away. During the spring floods, river barge traffic on the Karath River system reached its annual peak. Merchants who needed to move cargo before the high water closed the upper tributaries paid premium rates. The barge operators ran their entire fleets at maximum capacity. Any vessel out of service during the spring flood window lost a full quarter of its annual revenue. Drevenmarch and Solian were waiting until the barge operators' softwood patches began failing. Based on the timelines in the repair logs, that was going to happen right before the spring floods, the worst possible moment for the operators. At that point, the 2 houses would release their stockpile at whatever price they wanted, 3 times market rate, 4 times. Whatever number they decided desperate men would pay. It was a beautiful trap, patient, well-constructed. The operators had no way out because all the available supply was in 2 sets of warehouses. Except, I went back to the Velmere Forest Blight report, all the way back to the section that Aldrich had clearly stopped reading after the first page. The blight had hit the mature, older growth stands, the massive trees, the ones that produce the wide plank structural timber needed for new hull construction and major structural work. High volume, high value, the kind of wood that justified the Drevenmarch and Solian stockpiling operation. But the younger growth sections, the secondary and tertiary stands that produced narrower timber, were completely unaffected. Young ironwood wasn't suitable for structural hull work, too narrow for the primary load-bearing planks. But for repair work, patches, framing, internal bracing, deck planking, it was exactly right. Better than softwood in every dimension. And unlike the mature stands, which produced a single large harvest every several years, young ironwood stands could be harvested continuously, 4 times a year. The trees coppiced and regrew. The young growth market had never been strategically important enough for Drevenmarch or Solian to bother controlling. They'd focused entirely on the mature timber. Nobody had cornered the young growth, because nobody had thought of it yet. I folded the blight report and put it in my coat pocket. "Pell," I said, I need to know who currently holds the primary harvest contracts in the young growth sections of the Velmere forest, and I need to arrange a trip north. He blinked. You're going to Velmere? Day after tomorrow, I said. Make the arrangements. Velmere was 2 days' hard ride north of Carath. I left before dawn on a gray morning with Pell's directions and a set of notes I'd written out the previous night and reviewed 3 times on the road. The young growth contracts were held by 3 families, independent operations. The kind that had been cutting timber in the same forest valleys for 4 generations and had built their entire existence around the steady, modest income of supplying a market that no major house had ever bothered to pay attention to. The largest of the 3 was run by a woman named Brea. I'd been told she was straightforward, which in my experience meant she was direct about what she wanted and uninterested in preamble. That was fine. I was direct too. I found her operation mid-morning, 40 workers in a clearing, moving timber onto 2 heavy wagons with the efficient rhythm of people who had been doing this specific work long enough that it required no thought. Brea herself was standing at the edge of the clearing with a tally board, checking loads. She saw me coming from a distance and watched me approach with the flat, patient expression of a person who had made their judgment about city visitors years ago and didn't update it without compelling evidence. What does the Voren house want with young ironwood? She said before I'd finished dismounting. Nobody wants young ironwood. The barge operators in Carath want it, I said. They just don't know it yet. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at my horse, then at my coat, then back at me. Explain that, she said. I explained it. The repair log situation, the softwood patches, the timing, the spring floods. I didn't explain the Dreven March and Solian stockpile. That was more detail than she needed, and it would have raised questions about where I'd gotten the information. I focused on the barge operator's specific need and why young ironwood met it better than anything else currently available to them. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. You're saying you can sell my whole output to the barge houses, she said, at a guaranteed price, 20% above your current market rate, paid in advance for the first 3 months. Paid in advance, she repeated. Flat. The tone of someone testing whether they've heard correctly. In advance, before the first delivery. She looked at me with the expression I'd seen before on the faces of very smart people who have been operating in a market their whole lives and have just been told something that doesn't fit their model of how that market works. The Voren house doesn't have money, she said. Everyone knows that. The Voren house is going to have money, I said. That's why I'm here before everyone else. I paused. That's what advance payment means. You get paid before the revenue is generated. The risk is mine, not yours. She thought about this for longer than I expected, not hesitating, calculating. She was working through the angles the way someone does when they've been burned before by people who came in from the city talking about guaranteed prices. I want the same terms for the other 2 families, she said finally. Oren and Seld. We've worked alongside each other for 20 years. I won't put myself in competition with them. Same terms for all 3, I said. I'll need to meet with them as well, but you can tell them I'm coming. She put out her hand. Don't be late with the advance payment, she said. I won't. I shook her hand. 2 days later, I had contracts with all 3 families. The total advance payment required was 11,000 marks. I didn't have 11,000 marks. I had approximately 400 marks in operating cash and the paper value of 3 assets that were underperforming badly. To get the 11,000, I needed to have a conversation I'd been putting off. Mira Solte occupied an office in the financial district that was decorated with the specific aesthetic of a person who has no interest in impressing visitors. Clean, functional. The furniture was good quality and old, the kind of pieces that had been good quality for 30 years and would be good quality for 30 more. No display, no statement, just a workspace. She had been running the Solte lending house for 30 years. She had seen every variety of desperate, hopeful, or deluded merchant walk through her door and had developed, through sheer exposure, an economy of assessment that she applied to every new person in about 15 seconds. She applied it to me when I sat down. Her expression said, "I've heard whatever you're about to say before. It probably won't work, and the reason I'm listening is out of professional obligation rather than optimism." "Voren," she said, "your father borrowed 60,000 marks from my house at 14% interest. The loan is 3 months in arrears. Under the standard terms, it's callable. I assume you're here to ask for an extension." "I'm here to borrow 30,000 more," I said. The expression shifted, not to warmth, to something sharper and more careful. "At what rate?" "Whatever rate you want to charge," I said. "I don't particularly care about the rate. What I care about is the term. I need 90 days. She looked at me steadily. "You don't care about the rate." "Not particularly. The operation I'm executing has a known return timeline. The rate affects margin but doesn't change the fundamental structure. 90 days is the variable that matters." "What's the operation?" "A supply chain arbitrage," I said. "There's a timing mismatch in the timber market. I've secured the supply. I need the capital to pay the advance before the revenue arrives." She leaned back. 90 days, whatever rate I choose, for 30,000 new principal plus the 60,000 outstanding, she calculated. At 18%, which is what you'll get from me given the risk profile, the total repayment in 90 days is approximately 107,000 marks. Agreed. The word came out clean and flat. No hesitation. This appeared to confuse her slightly. Not dramatically. She was too controlled for that. But I noticed the almost imperceptible pause before she spoke again. "If you fail to repay in 90 days, she said, "the seizure clause on the existing loan extends to cover all outstanding principal. I would have legal claim to the Voren building, the tannery, the barge stake, and the East Dock warehouse." "I understand. You'd walk away with nothing." "Yes." She studied me. "What do you want from me beyond the capital?" "A letter," I said. "If I repay in full and on time, I want a written confirmation from your house that the Voren debt has been satisfied and that Solte Lending considers the house creditworthy." She was quiet for several seconds. "That letter would be worth considerably more than the interest you're paying me," she said. "Yes," I agreed. "That's why I'm asking for it now instead of later." "You understand that I would only write that letter if I genuinely believed it," she said. "I don't write those letters as favors. I write them when they're true. You're asking me to stake my house's reputation on your repayment." "I'm asking you to consider offering it as a term," I said. "You decide whether you believe it's warranted when the time comes." Another long pause. "I've been in this business for 30 years, she said, "and I've never once had someone sit in that chair and tell me they don't care about the rate." "What does that tell you?" She picked up her pen. "It tells me one of two things. Either you're a genius or you're an idiot." She began writing. "The letter will be conditional on full repayment, including all accrued interest by day 90, not day 91, day 90. "Understood." "Genius or idiot," she said again, almost to herself. "I genuinely cannot determine which yet." "Give me 90 days, I said. She slid the contract across the desk. I signed it. "Here is what I spent the following 6 weeks doing, and why." The advance payments went out to Brea and the other 2 families within a week of the Solte agreement closing. Full amounts, as promised, delivered by courier with witnessed receipts. Brea sent back a single line. "Deliveries begin in 3 weeks." While waiting for the first timber delivery, I began the second part of the operation, which was making sure the barge operators knew the supply existed before Drevenmarch and Solian made their move. I needed to do this carefully. If I announced publicly that young ironwood repair timber was available through the Voren house, Drevenmarch would notice immediately and could potentially acquire competing young growth contracts or apply political pressure through their guild relationships to block my suppliers. The whole operation depended on moving faster than they were watching, so I went direct. 1 operator at a time, private meetings. The first was Toven. He ran a fleet of 7 vessels on the southern river routes and had, according to the repair logs, just had his oldest vessel fail a full hull inspection. The third failed inspection in 18 months. He'd been patching with softwood for so long that 2 of his 7 barges were now technically unsafe to load at full capacity. He was losing freight contracts. I showed up at his dry dock at 6 in the morning. He was already there, standing over a half-dismantled hull section with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that kept coming out wrong. He looked at me with no welcome. "Vorenhouse, your father owed me a delivery guarantee from 2 years ago that was never honored. Is that why you're here?" "I'm here because in approximately 6 weeks, Drevenmarch and Solian are going to release approximately 18 months of stockpiled ironwood at somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times the current market rate," I said. "And you're going to be forced to pay it because your fleet is currently too degraded to wait out a price dispute." He stared at me. "I have a different offer," I said. "Young ironwood, repair grade, enough volume to fully restore every vessel in your fleet, available in 4 weeks, market rate plus 15%, exclusive supply for your fleet for 12 months. Young ironwood won't do structural hull work," he said. "You don't need structural hull work right now. You need patch repairs, deck planking, and internal bracing. Young ironwood handles all of that better than the softwood you've been using, and it'll last 5 seasons instead of 1. He looked at me with the careful suspicion of a man who has been in a bad situation for long enough that any solution sounds like a trap. "How do you know about the Drevenmarch and Solian stockpile?" he said. "I did the research," I said. "The information is in the public filings. You or anyone else could have found it. Nobody bothered." He looked at the hull section, then at me. "The rate you're quoting, market plus 15. Where are you sourcing from?" I showed him the contracts with Brea's families. He read them carefully, checked the seals, checked the dates. "The delivery timeline is real," he said. "First delivery arrives in Carath in 3 weeks. I can show you the freight booking if you want confirmation." He was quiet for a long moment. "If I sign an exclusive supply agreement with you and Drevenmarch finds out—" "Drevenmarch's leverage is the scarcity of available supply," I said. "Once you have supply, their leverage disappears. They can't punish you for buying timber from an independent source. There's no guild rule against it." He looked at the hull section one more time. "Send me the contract terms tonight," he said. "I'll have it signed by morning." I saw the second operator that afternoon, the third the following morning. All 3 signed. By the end of the second week, I had purchase agreements with all 3 major barge operators covering approximately half their total annual repair timber need. It wasn't a complete solution for them. It was never going to be, but it was enough to take the desperation out of the equation. Enough that when Drevenmarch and Solian finally moved, the operators had alternatives. Imperfect alternatives, but alternatives. The corner had a leak. The Drevenmarch and Solian release happened in week 7. Their timing was slightly off. They waited 1 week longer than I'd anticipated, probably because they were watching barge activity and waiting for more vessels to fail inspection. But the broad picture was as I'd expected. They announced available supply at a rate of 2.7 times the prevailing market price. A statement was released through the Timber Guild framing this as a response to severe supply constraints in the ironwood market, which was technically not wrong. The barge operators responded the way any buyer responds when they have an alternative. They bought what they needed from me at market plus 15% and gave Drevenmarch and Solian polite notices that their prices were not competitive. Not all of them. 2 smaller operators who weren't in my supply agreements did end up paying Drevenmarch's rate. That was expected. You can't corner the whole market. But the 3 largest operators, who represented roughly 60% of the annual repair timber demand in Carath, didn't buy at the emergency rate. The corner was supposed to generate 70 to 80,000 marks in profit. With 3 of the 5 major buyers not participating, the actual capture was somewhere between 15 and 20,000 marks, barely enough to cover 18 months of warehouse carrying costs. Word reached me through Pell's contacts at the Timber Guild. "The Drevenmarch factor was apparently furious," Pell said. He was making a serious effort to keep his tone neutral and not quite succeeding. "He's saying someone deliberately intervened in their operation." "He's right," I said. Pell blinked. You're not going to deny it? Not to you, I said. He's asking who backed us, I assume. He thinks someone major must be behind the Voren house, Pell said, because no independent house this size could have moved that fast without institutional support. I thought about that for a moment. Don't correct anyone who reaches that conclusion, I said. You want people to think we have powerful backers. I want people to ask the question, I said. The question itself is useful. An answer would end the speculation. Let it run. Pell wrote something in his notes, then looked up. The timber deliveries are running on schedule. The barge operators are satisfied. The spring flood season starts in 2 weeks, and 3 of the 5 major fleets are fully operational for the first time in 18 months. He paused. That's actually good. For the river trade. Yes, I said. You could have charged more than market plus 15. I could have, I agreed. Why didn't you? I looked at him. Because the barge operators are going to be my customers for the next decade. Because Brea's families are going to be my suppliers for the next decade. Because a relationship built on fair terms compounds in your favor over time in ways that a single extraction event never can. I turned back to the desk. Short-term extraction is what Drevenmarch was doing. It works once, then everyone finds a way around you. Pell was quiet for a moment. Then he went back to his notes. He was starting to understand. I could see it. On day 82, I walked into Mira Solte's office and put a closed leather satchel on her desk. She looked at it, then at me. You're 8 days early, she said. I know, I said. Open it. She opened it, counted the contents, counted again. Looked up. 112,000 marks, she said. 107,000 exactly owed, I said. The extra 5 is a voluntary addition. I wanted the letter to be written from a position of complete clarity about our relationship. She was quiet for a long time. The timber operation, she said. Yes. You executed it cleanly. The suppliers delivered on time and the buyers paid on schedule. I planned correctly for those things. You knew the corner was there before you came to see me, she said. It was not a question. Yes. And you were confident enough in the execution that you didn't care what rate I charged you. I was confident in the analysis, I said. The execution had variables. It could have gone wrong in several ways, but the fundamental read was correct. She looked at the satchel for another moment. Then she pulled out a clean sheet of paper and began writing. Her handwriting was precise. She wrote for about 2 minutes, then folded the letter, sealed it with the Solte house wax, and handed it across the desk. I took it, read the outside. Solte Lending House, to whom it may concern. I don't write those letters often, she said. I know. I've been in this business for 30 years, she said again. But this time the sentence had a different weight to it. Not a warning, almost a statement of respect, from one professional to another. What are you going to do next? Several things, I said, but I'll need a larger capital facility at some point. When I do, I'd like to discuss it with you first. She looked at me steadily. You know where my office is, she said. I stood and put the letter in my coat. Genius or idiot, I said. She almost smiled. Come back in a year and I'll tell you. The Solte letter changed the room temperature everywhere I went for the following 2 weeks. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. These things don't work that way. But in the merchant quarter of Karath, a letter from the Solte house was a specific kind of signal. Mira Solte didn't write letters of creditworthiness as professional courtesies. She wrote them when she meant them, when her own house's reputation was comfortable writing on the statement. Merchants who had been politely unavailable started becoming available. Guild officials who had been processing Voren paperwork at the absolute minimum speed began processing it at normal speed. 2 creditors who had initiated seizure proceedings quietly withdrew them and sent notes asking to discuss restructured repayment schedules. I was in the middle of responding to the 3rd of these notes when Pell came to the doorway with a look on his face that I'd come to recognize as the expression he wore when something unexpected had happened, and he wasn't sure how to categorize it. There's someone here, he said. He says he used to work for the River Guild. His name is Edric Tan. Edric Tan was 63 years old, thin with the posture of a man who had spent decades hunched over ledgers and audit tables. He had been the senior accounts auditor for the River Guild for 22 years before retiring 2 years ago. He sat across from me with a leather satchel on his knees and the calm expression of someone who had made a considered decision and arrived prepared to explain it. I heard about the Ironwood situation, he said. What you did, how you did it. News travels, I said. In the merchant quarter it does. He folded his hands on top of the satchel. I audited 12 of the major houses during my career at the Guild. I know where the skeletons are in most of them. I know the real numbers behind their public filings. I know which partnerships are solid and which ones are one bad season away from collapse. He paused. I retired because I thought the work I was doing wasn't going anywhere useful. Everything I found went into a filing cabinet and nothing changed. And you think it would go somewhere useful here, I said. I think you're the first person I've seen in this city who is running an operation the way it should be run, he said. And I'd rather be useful than retired. I looked at him. What do you want? A salary, a small equity share in anything I directly generate, and the right to tell you when I think you're making a mistake. You'll use that third one, I said. Frequently, he said without apology. I hired him before he finished the sentence. The second person came 3 weeks later. Her name was Safi. She ran a courier and logistics business out of the South Quarter with 12 riders, 3 of whom ran routes through the city and outlying roads that the major guilds had never officially mapped. Not illegal, just unregistered. The kind of route network that accumulated, over years, a remarkable volume of information about what was moving through the city and who was moving it. I'd traced her through a pattern. 4 separate independent merchants, in 4 separate conversations about 4 separate topics, had each used the phrase, "I heard through a South Quarter contact," when explaining where they'd gotten a piece of market information. When I mapped those 4 pieces of information to what I knew about timing and sources, they all pointed to a single node. She looked at me when I arrived at her office with the expression of someone who was not surprised to have a visitor but was calibrating whether this particular visitor was a threat or an opportunity. "You're Voren," she said. "Yes." "I've been following what you're doing," she said. "The timber play was clean, fast. You moved before anyone was watching." "I had better information than the people running the corner," I said. "You had publicly available information," she said. "They had the same information. They just didn't read it." "Yes." She leaned back. "What do you want from me?" "I want to pay for what you already have," I said. "Market intelligence, real time. What's moving, who's buying, what's quiet that shouldn't be quiet. I don't need you to do anything different than what you're already doing. I just want a channel." "And in return?" "A retainer, monthly, and a success fee on anything your information directly contributes to." She named a number. It was high. I didn't negotiate. She blinked. "You're not going to counter?" "The number is fair for the value," I said. "Negotiating it down makes the relationship transactional from the start. That's not the kind of relationship this needs to be." She studied me for a long moment. "When I was building this operation," she said slowly, "I went to 6 merchant houses looking for a partnership arrangement. Every single one of them tried to lowball me and then complained about the information quality when I gave them less than everything I had." "I know," I said. "I heard about it." She was quiet. "You heard about it from someone who'd been to 4 of those houses," she said. 3, I said. The other one I pieced together. For the first time, she smiled. It was a measuring smile, the kind that says you did your homework. "Monthly retainer plus the success fee structure you described," she said. "I want it in writing." "I'll have Pell draw it up this afternoon," I said. The third recruit was not someone I went looking for. His name was Corin. He was 25. Youngest son of a minor noble family whose lands had been seized 3 years prior in a debt dispute. He'd been working as a junior factor for a textile house, doing the kind of competent logistics work that smart people with no capital get trapped in for decades. He showed up at the Voren office on a Tuesday morning with a leather folio and the focused energy of someone who had been building toward a moment for a while and was finally standing in it. He put the folio on my desk and sat down. "Solian Consortium," he said. "They run a monopoly on purple and crimson dye imports into Karath. Every textile house in the city buys through their distribution network. The markup over actual import cost is roughly 40%. He opened the folio and put 2 pages of figures in front of me. "There are 2 independent importers out of the eastern ports who have supply and ships and prices 25% below Solian's rate. They've been trying to break into the Karath market for years and can't. Solian has the distribution relationships locked up." He put a 3rd page down. "The Voren tannery outside the city walls has 3 storage buildings currently operating at approximately 25% capacity. With minimal conversion work, they could function as a distribution hub." He folded his hands. "You bring the infrastructure, I bring the importer contacts, and I manage the operation. We split the margin 50-50 after costs." I looked at the figures, then at him. "Why Voren?" I said. "Why not approach one of the established houses? Solian is a powerful enemy to make." "The established houses are afraid of Solian," he said, simply, as a fact. "And you think I'm not. You ran a direct operation against a cartel play by 2 of the largest houses in Karath 2 months into running a bankrupt trading house," he said. "Either you're not afraid of Solian or you don't fully understand what they're capable of." He paused. "I'm betting on the first one." I looked at the figures again. They were clean, well-researched. He'd done real work on the importer relationships and the cost structures. "The 50-50 split is on the net margin after costs," I said. "Yes." "In 3 recruits, 1 retired auditor with a perfect memory and no patience for waste, 1 information network covering the South Quarter and 3 informal road routes, 1 former noble who understood the dye supply chain better than anyone in the legitimate market. The team was not large, but every position on it was doing something essential that I couldn't do myself. The dye operation started generating income within 6 weeks of the first delivery. It was modest income at first. We were working against Solian's established relationships, and textile houses didn't abandon a known supplier on the basis of a better price alone. They needed to test the product quality, they needed delivery reliability, they needed to believe that the Voren house wasn't going to disappear in 3 months and leave them without supply. Trust is built slowly and destroyed fast. That's true in every market. We built it the same way every time. Delivered on time, delivered full quantities, didn't overextend the operation in pursuit of faster growth. Each textile house that converted from Solian became a reference for the next one. By the 3rd month, we had 7 active accounts. By the 5th, 14. Solian noticed at around the 6-week mark. Their response was what I'd expected. They went to the Textile Guild and filed a complaint alleging that the Voren house was operating an unlicensed distribution operation. The relevant rule was technically real. A distribution license was required for commodity resale within city limits. The rule existed specifically to give guild members with the right relationships a way to slow down competition. The fine was manageable. We applied for the license. It was approved. The operation continued. But the filing was information. It told me that Solian was watching us, that they were willing to use regulatory mechanisms aggressively, and that they had enough guild relationships to move a complaint through the system within 2 weeks of noticing a problem. I called Edric in. "Tell me everything you know about Solian's guild relationships," I said. "Financial ones specifically. Who owes them money, who's done favors for them, what the dependencies look like." He sat down, folded his hands, and talked for 41 minutes without notes. What emerged was a picture I had partially expected and partially not. The Solian Consortium had spent 15 years building a network of financial dependencies through the guild system. Not just trade relationships, actual debt. Guildmasters and senior factors who had taken private loans from Solian-affiliated lenders at rates that were favorable on the surface but that had clauses buried in the fine print that made them effectively callable on demand if the borrowers ceased to cooperate. It was an elegant architecture. In my past life, I'd seen it built with corporate board seats and revolving credit. Here it was, built with private loan instruments and guild position leverage. Same structure, different materials. When you were auditing the River Guild, I said, did you ever encounter anything in Solian's filings that didn't add up? He was quiet for a moment. Once, he said. 4 years ago, a discrepancy between their declared import volumes and their actual warehouse receipts. I flagged it as a reporting anomaly. It was reviewed and cleared. Cleared by whom? He named a name. The current deputy master of the River Guild. How large was the discrepancy? He told me. It was a significant number. Large enough that if it represented what I was beginning to think it might represent, the implications reached well beyond a guild compliance issue. Do you still think it was a legitimate reporting error? I said. He was silent for longer this time. No, he said finally. At the time I filed the flag, I was told the explanation was administrative. But when I reviewed the adjusted figures, they were too clean. Real administrative errors leave traces. These had been corrected smoothly, the kind of smooth that requires intentional effort. I leaned back. I need Safi on this, I said. The investigation took 4 weeks. Safi worked through contacts she'd been developing for years. People in the import records offices, the guild filing rooms, the private cargo networks that passed through the South Quarter routes. She was careful, methodical. She shared nothing with me until she had 3 independent sources confirming the same picture. When she brought it to me, she came in the evening after the office had cleared, just the 2 of us. She put a single sheet of paper on the desk with a handwritten summary. 4 years, minimum. The Solian Consortium had been running a secondary import operation, entirely unregistered, not declared to any guild, not subject to any of the standard duty frameworks, moving standard commercial goods through the city under fictitious cargo manifests. The goods themselves were legal, the channel was not. By moving them outside the registered system, Solian was avoiding the import duties that every legitimate merchant house in Karath paid. Duties that were, by royal charter, supposed to flow directly into the crown treasury. Over 4 years, the accumulated duty avoidance was estimated at somewhere between 200 and 250,000 gold marks. 250,000 marks that should have gone to the king and hadn't. I sat with the number for a long time. In my past life, I had uncovered schemes like this 3 times. The mechanism was always the same. A dominant market player, confident in their guild relationships and regulatory capture, using administrative blind spots to extract value from a system that theoretically protected everyone equally. The move, when you found it, was never confrontation. Confrontation invited countermoves. The entity doing this was powerful enough that direct confrontation, filing with the guild, threatening exposure, would result in a rapid escalation that I wasn't equipped to win. The correct move was to rut around every layer of Solian's influence and put the information directly in front of the one authority they couldn't touch. I spent 3 days writing the letter, 12 pages. Every figure sourced and cited, every discrepancy documented with cross-referenced records from Safi's sources, from Edric's memory of the flagged audit, from the guild registry discrepancies that were publicly available to anyone who looked for them. The methodology for calculating the duty avoidance was laid out in full, with a conservative estimate and an upper bound. I addressed it to the Royal Treasury Inspector's office, not the guild, not any structure that Solian's financial dependencies could reach. The Royal Treasury Inspector operated under independent royal charter, answering only to the crown, specifically because the kingdom's revenue depended on it not being capturable by merchant interests. I signed it with the Voren House seal and sent it with a private courier. Then I waited. The Treasury Inspector's office moved slowly by design and decisively by mandate. 6 weeks after I submitted the letter, 2 investigators arrived at the Solian Consortium's primary offices with a formal audit notice. Safi told me within 2 hours of it happening. By the afternoon, the news had spread through the merchant quarter with the speed that significant news always travels when it involves a powerful institution suddenly looking vulnerable. Three of Solian's smaller creditors quietly accelerated repayment demands. Two guild allies canceled standing cooperation agreements with no explanation given. I watched the ripples and noted them. This is the other thing that's constant across every market. Everyone wants to be on the winning side, and everyone can identify faster than they'll publicly admit when a position starts deteriorating. The people who had been obligated to Solian through their debt dependencies began recalculating whether the obligation was worth maintaining. The investigation ran for 5 months. During that time, we continued building. The DIE operation expanded to 22 active accounts and had begun to genuinely threaten Solian's market share, which was, I suspected, part of why the investigation had teeth. Every week we operated, we were demonstrating that Solian's pricing power rested entirely on monopoly rather than merit. The tannery outside the city, which had been reporting losses for 3 years, underwent a different kind of assessment under Edric's supervision. The losses, it turned out, were partly structural and partly manufactured. The previous tannery manager had been understating output and pocketing the difference. Edric found it in 2 days by comparing the hide purchase volumes against the production records. The manager was terminated, the outstanding losses were documented for future legal recovery, and a new manager was appointed from among the tannery workers who actually knew the operation. With honest management and a minor capital injection for equipment maintenance, the tannery turned to profit in its second month. The barge stake, that 15% position in the Karath Southern Fleet, had been generating distribution significantly below what the fleet's operational performance suggested it should. I'd circled this issue in my first review of the ledgers and never had time to pursue it. Edric, with his River Guild background, took it on directly. What he found was that the fleet's general manager had been running a side arrangement with 2 of the fleet's 5 major cargo clients, diverting a portion of their freight payments into a separate account that didn't appear in the official distribution calculations. It was modest, not the kind of sophisticated fraud that required elaborate architecture, just the quiet, habitual extraction of a small amount per transaction that added up over years. The general manager resigned when presented with the documentation. With honest distribution calculations, the barge stake began generating income approximately 60% higher than it had under Aldrich's ownership. The East Dock warehouse, empty and underperforming, was repurposed. Corin, through his textile and dye contacts, had identified 6 independent merchants whose operations needed short-term overflow storage and who were paying premium rates at the only 2 commercial warehouses in Karath that weren't operated by major guild-affiliated houses. We offered them better rates. They moved their storage. The warehouse went from generating near-zero income to reliable positive cash flow within 90 days. Every revenue stream was small. None of them individually moved the needle significantly, but collectively they compounded. The formal findings from the Royal Treasury investigation were released near the end of the summer, 8 months after I'd submitted the letter. I read the official document twice, then I put it on Edric's desk and watched him read it. The Solian Consortium had been assessed for duty avoidance on imports totaling 230,000 gold marks over the documented period. 3 senior factors had been fined individually. The deputy master of the River Guild had been removed from his position and referred for criminal review on charges of regulatory malfeasance. The consortium itself faced a penalty of 190,000 marks and was placed under compulsory audit oversight for 5 years. It didn't destroy them. They were too large and too well structured across too many operations to be destroyed by a single investigation. But the architecture had cracked. The web of financial dependencies they'd built through the guilds had lost its coherence as soon as it became known that the center of it was legally compromised. Favors stopped being called in. Loan terms were quietly renegotiated. Guild officials who had been cooperative became formally neutral. The monopoly on the dye supply didn't survive the first full audit cycle. 3 independent importers entered the market within 4 months of the investigation's conclusion. Prices dropped by nearly 30%. The textile houses that had been paying Solian's rates for years were noticeably enthusiastic about having alternatives. Corin came into my office when the findings were released and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the document. The dye operation wasn't just about the dye, he said. No. You knew what we'd find when you started looking, he said. You knew Solian would have something. I suspected they would, I said. Houses that rely on regulatory capture to maintain market position usually do it because they have something to protect. Legitimate businesses don't need to own the regulator. And the Ironwood play, that was also about positioning against Solian. Among other things, I said, I needed operating capital and a proof of concept, but choosing a play that also damaged a Solian cartel operation was efficient. He looked at me with the expression I'd seen before on the faces of people recalibrating something. You were 2 moves ahead of where I thought you were, he said. Usually 3, I said, but sometimes 2. It depends on the visibility. He almost laughed. Then his expression turned to something more serious. The southern trade route, he said. Solian's collapse left a gap in the premium goods channel, the Edenmore to Port pipeline for high-margin cargo. Luxury goods, fine cloth, specialty ingredients. They owned that channel and managed it badly. I know, I said. That gap has maybe 6 months before one of the established houses fills it. 4, if I'm reading the current positioning correctly, I said, we need to move first. Write me the full proposal, I said. Route maps, volume projections, capital requirements, risk assessment, everything. He turned to the map he'd been studying for weeks and looked at it with the focused energy of someone who already had the answer and needed to find the most efficient path to saying it. I'll have it by the end of the week, he said. Tomorrow, I said. He blinked. Tomorrow morning, I said. You've been building this in your head for 2 months. Write it down. He came back at dawn. The end of the first full year of Voron house operations under my management looked like this. 430,000 marks of inherited debt, fully discharged. The last payment had been made 6 weeks prior. I had certified discharge letters from every creditor, including the 3 who had initially filed seizure proceedings. Current revenue streams, the young Ironwood supply operation, now in its second contract cycle with the barge operators, the dye distribution network, 22 active accounts, growing, the tannery, now profitable, the barge stake distributions, now accurately calculated, the warehouse rental income, and a short-term lending desk that Pell had built and was running with a precision and care that was generating both income and a reputation in the market for fair terms and fast processing. The lending desk had been Edric's idea, and Pell's execution had been the reason it worked. There was a gap in the capital market for small-volume, short-term bridge credit for merchants who were creditworthy but too small for the major houses to bother with. The Voron house had recently been in exactly that position. We understood the experience from the inside. Pell had a natural talent for credit assessment that combined careful record-keeping with something harder to name, a sensitivity to the difference between a merchant who was temporarily cash-constrained and one who was structurally insolvent. We hadn't lost a single lending position in the first year. Pell had a title now. He had a raise. He had 2 junior clerks of his own. He carried himself differently than the nervous young man who had been waiting to be told he was unemployed when I first arrived. Not arrogance, something quieter. The confidence of someone who has been trusted with real responsibility and has met it. Safi's network had expanded into 2 additional road routes that she'd identified as underserved information channels. The intelligence she provided had contributed directly to 4 separate decisions in the past year, all of which had returned value significantly above her fee. Edric had not once been wrong about a number and had told me I was making a mistake on 3 separate occasions. He'd been right all 3 times. Corin's southern route proposal was on my desk, complete, detailed, with 3 scenarios ranging from conservative to aggressive. The conservative scenario alone showed a potential revenue line that would double the house's current income within 18 months if executed correctly. I sat at the desk, the same desk polished now, the inkwell upright, the candles replaced, and looked at the ledger. The numbers were cleanly positive, the sum of 12 months of work. I thought about the 8 men who had stood in this room on the first morning, the red-faced man with his pointed finger, the confidence in the room that morning, the certainty that this ending was already written. The ledger in front of me had a different ending. The summons from the palace arrived on a clear morning in early autumn. Pell brought it in personally, which he only did when something was significantly out of the ordinary. He placed it on the desk without a word and stood back. The envelope was heavy, good paper. The seal was the royal treasury crest, a set of scales above the Edenmore crown, pressed in dark red wax. My name on the front in the formal handwriting of a court secretary. I broke the seal and read it. The Royal Treasury Inspector wished to meet with the representative of the Voren Trading House regarding matters of financial counsel. The language was formal, the tone was careful in the specific way that government communications are careful when they're asking for something rather than demanding it. Matters of financial counsel, not a complaint, not a summons for testimony in the Solian investigation which had concluded. Something else. I put the letter down, then I called the team in, all 4 of them. Pell and Edric and Safi and Corin, who had arrived early as usual and was already at the map wall reviewing the southern route projections. I put the letter in the middle of the desk. "Read it," I said. They read it. Safi was the first to speak. "This isn't about the Solian investigation." "No," I said. "The investigation is closed. This is a new conversation." She looked at the seal. "The Treasury Inspector doesn't request meetings for routine matters. He doesn't need to. He subpoenas." She looked at me. "He's asking. That means he wants something he can't compel." Edric was quiet for longer. He had the expression of someone doing arithmetic in his head against a data set he'd been building for months. "The Royal Treasury's position," he said slowly. "I've been watching their public filings, the revenue figures against expenditure." He paused. "They don't close." "How bad?" Corin asked. Edric shook his head slightly. "Without internal figures, I can only estimate. But based on the public data, the kingdom's treasury has been in structural deficit for at least 4 years. The gap between revenue and expenditure has been widening." He looked at me. "You've looked at those numbers, too." "Yes," I said. "How bad is your read?" I looked at the letter, then at the map on the wall, at the trade routes, the port cities, the whole network of commerce that ran through this kingdom, and that, if you understood it fully, really understood it, not just the surface flows but the real structure underneath, was legible as a set of numbers, a very large set of numbers, with a very significant problem buried in them. "Worse than public," I said. "The duty collection inefficiencies alone are costing the crown somewhere between 80 and 120,000 marks annually. The guild monopoly structures that Solian was the most visible example of are suppressing taxable trade volume across the whole kingdom. The agricultural tax base is declining because nobody has restructured the assessment methodology in 40 years, and it no longer maps to how the land is actually used." I paused. "And those are just the revenue problems. The expenditure side has its own architecture." The room was quiet. "They want you to fix it," Corin said. "They want to talk about whether it's fixable," I said. "Which is a different question. And they want to talk to someone who demonstrated, in a highly public way, that they could identify the structural problem in a major cartel operation and dismantle it using only publicly available information and 1 letter." Safi looked at me. "1 letter and a timber play and a dye operation and a guild investigation and a barge stake recovery and a lending desk and—" "1 letter," I said. That's what they saw. The rest was preparation for having the right thing to say in the letter. She almost smiled. I picked up the letter and refolded it. "Edric," I said, "I need a full model of the kingdom's financial position. Everything we can reconstruct from public data. Tax revenue by sector, duty collection by route, expenditure by function as far as we can determine it. I want the whole picture, with gaps noted and assumptions documented." He was already reaching for his notes. "Safi," I said, I need whatever your network has heard about the Treasury's internal position. Any rumor? Any movement of gold? Any unusual borrowing? Any conversation that touched on the Crown's finances? She nodded once and stood. Corin, I said. Southern route proposal. I want it finalized and ready to present. He turned from the map. You want to bring it to the palace meeting? I want to go to that meeting having already solved one of the problems they're going to describe to me, I said. If the Treasury's issue is partly about suppressed trade volume on the southern routes, showing up with a functioning solution is better than showing up with analysis. He turned back to the map. His jaw was set. He was already working. I looked at Pell, who had been quiet throughout. The lending desk, I said. How quickly could you scale it? He blinked. Scale it how? In terms of volume? In terms of scope, right now we're doing short-term bridge credit for small merchants. If the model works at that level, it works very well at that level, he said carefully. What would it take to apply the same model to a larger population? Rural merchants, small-scale producers, people who currently have no access to capital at any rate. He thought about it, not defensively, seriously, running numbers in his head. Infrastructure, he said. We'd need more people doing the credit assessment work. We'd need a way to verify claims remotely. The verification problem is the hardest part. That's the problem to solve, I said. Think about it. Write me a proposal. He nodded, already thinking. I stood up and walked to the window. Below, the merchant quarter moved through its morning. Carts, couriers, the guild buildings at the far end of the road, flags flying. The river docks visible at the edge of the skyline, barge traffic moving steadily in both directions, with no sign of the crisis that had been building 18 months ago when softwood patches were failing and operators were running out of options. In my past life, they had called me ruthless. I had never found the word accurate. Ruthless implied that I removed things by force. What I actually did was simpler and less dramatic. I found the gap between what something was and what it could be, and I worked in that gap, sometimes slowly, often faster than people expected, but always with the gap as the map. The kingdom's treasury had a gap, a very large gap, the kind of gap that had been widening for years while everyone around it adapted to the new normal, wrote adjustments into their expectations, and stopped asking whether it had to be this way. I turned from the window. The palace was waiting. I put on my coat. Corin, I said, how much of the southern route model is ready to present? 70%, he said. I need 2 more hours for the volume projections. You have one, I said. I want to arrive early. He turned back to the desk. I walked out the door. The Voren House, 14 months ago, had been a name that every bank in Karath had written off. A ledger of catastrophic losses and an address in the merchant quarter where creditors came to collect on obligations that could not be met. Now a king wanted to talk about his money. I walked through the merchant quarter with a letter in my coat and the morning sun coming off the guild hall windows at a low angle that turned the whole street briefly gold. Same world as any other world. Fear, greed, the space between them. And somewhere in that space, always, a gap that nobody had bothered to close yet. I smiled. I walked through the morning toward the palace gates. I was just getting started.